The best evidence we have at present is that modern Homo sapiens arose in Africa about 100,000 years ago, at which point there may have only been 10,000 founders, and we're all descended from that common set of ancestors. So we're all part of the same species. We all have the same set of genes, but each of us has different variants of those genes, about 0.1% of our DNA to be exact, that differs between people. And some of those variants can be important in terms of predisposition to disease or adverse reactions to medications. So that's the medical importance of understanding human variation. Now, as people migrated out of Africa in various migrations to Europe, to Asia, gene flow, genetic migration occurring, these variations got spread around in different ways. And one consequence of that is that some variants are more common in one part of the globe and some in others. In many instances, that's just because of something we call genetic drift. That is, the variants weren't positive or negative in terms of their benefit, but just by drifting, they got more common in one place than the other. So if you look at a particular spelling difference, you might find it at a 40% frequency in Asia, and a 20% frequency in Europe, and a 30% frequency in Africa, and that wouldn't be surprising. But if you look between populations and say, how much of the genetic variance is actually accounted for by the fact that this population is over here and this one's over there, it's actually a pretty small fraction, only about 10%. Most of human genetic variation is in fact found within whatever group you look at. So the similarities between groups are actually profound, and the differences are relatively modest. Now, in some instances, a particular variant has actually provided an advantage to those who carry it. For instance, individuals who carried variants in certain genes where malaria was common, when those variants provided protection, were likely to survive and therefore to pass those variants on. And so, for instance, particular variants in the hemoglobin genes, such as sickle mutation or thalassemia, or in other genes like the G6PD gene, allowed individuals to do better if infected with malaria. And so those have reached a high frequency in parts of the world where malaria was common, but not so much in other parts of the world. So the bottom line is, we're all a lot alike. Genetic variation is only 0.1% of our DNA. There is some variability in terms of what you see in different parts of the world, and some of that may play a role in why some groups are more at risk or more protected for a particular disease. This makes it important, as we're doing biomedical research, to use defined populations so that we can understand the effect of genetics and environment and be sure when we make an inference whether or not it can be extrapolated to other groups.
What's a race-related view of crime? Well, you know from crime, for example, that the single biggest thing cause of crime is not race, it's aggression. So you look at aggression and go like, hey, white people are aggressive, black people are aggressive, right? They're white aggressive people in all white societies. If you look at that and you follow it down, you see, hang on, aggression is caused by change of hormone levels, right? So you can have different levels of cortisol. Women have much lower levels of cortisol than men. So women therefore aren't represented in violent crime. Men are. And without looking at race, and biological realism, we don't have an ability to return to your original question, for society to debate who is best suited to live with whom, which is what the question really is, right?
One flaw with that kind of theory or race realism, it speaks about the outcome. It doesn't really speak about the cause, meaning that if you take a look at national IQ different nations, they will tell you what it is right now. And you have to look at the context and so on. It's a flaw to say that a national IQ level cannot increase dramatically if you give it the right circumstances.
Well, let's take
what do you say about that?
Well, IQ is one example of something, but before we get even something less contentious as IQ, you can just look at certain things as being fundamentally genetically passed through. These traits could be intelligence in the case of IQ, there could be aggression, there could be hostility, there could be a lot of traits. The thing that has been taboo for half a century, at least because of the left's control of academia, has been the refusal to accept any biological genetic component for anybody.
Can I reemphasize another point that came up as well? Mm-hmm. Again, genes are not destiny. Mm-hmm. So to have the factor V Leiden mutation does not mean you're going to get a blood clot.
That's right.
And we don't even have good data yet to know what is the real frequency. We have relative risks, but we don't have absolute risks.
That's right.
I don't know what to tell my patient who turns out to have factor V Leiden and has never had a clot.
That's right.
I say watch out for clots. So we pay more attention. We're careful around surgery. We try not to stay in one position for a 5-hour plane ride.
Right.
But we really don't know exactly what it means. And even a BRCA gene mutation, the risk of breast cancer is high, probably 80% across the lifetime, but 80% is not 100%. And indeed, there are interventions that can reduce that risk.
Excellent point.
So just to reinforce, genes and destiny are separate things.
So if I took a full monoethnic white society, the left would still refuse a genetic explanation, a biological explanation, anything that differentiates the egalitarianism story that they hijacked. We in the New I'd say bullshit. So I've got half of me is Indian. So I've got a 20-something% higher propensity for type 2 diabetes.
We potentially could have come at this in terms of asthma or other conditions in which the environmental context is really a key either trigger or exacerbant. So there's probably not too much debate that there are genetic predispositions to asthma, but clearly we have to recognize that there are things about the context of certain housing conditions that really exacerbate that and then create a health disparity. And so in addressing that, clearly the genetic part is perhaps useful diagnostically, but we have to consider other aspects of access to things, whether it's access to a quality environment or the food or access to the ability to exercise. So there are things in dealing with health disparities that we recognize it's really a confluence, again, of the genetic, the biological, but as well as the socioeconomic and indeed policy implications. And so it's hard to deal with health disparities and just talk about genes and biology.
There's clearly bias involved.
Now, if the left came around and said, no, diabetes is a social construct. No, it's not. It's biological, right? But so is aggression. So are family crime rates. So are a bunch of other things that are taboo. Without examining and understanding the genetic explanations where there's always a balance between genes and environment, and to pretend it's 100% environment's a lie, 100% genetic, no one would claim because that's scientific absurdity. Between that balance and only through that balance, we'll be able to find truly honest answers to how we're going to live together and avoid an imminent civil war, right?
Well, let's take a look at the genetic claim. I have a study here in front of me here called the Flynn effect. Do you know what that is?
All throughout the 20th century, we can trace that each generation is scoring higher than its predecessor. That is, the average person on Ravens today is by definition 100. The average person in 1900 scored against current norms would have been somewhere between 50 and 70.
Trawling through huge quantities of raw data, Flynn noticed that IQ scores have risen on average by about 3 points per decade. He also found that the rise for black Americans was even faster. The IQ gap between blacks and whites was actually closing.
Blacks have gained at a faster rate than whites since World War II, certainly. Whites have been gaining something under 0.3 of a point a year, and blacks at about 4.45 points a year. In other words, blacks have been gaining about 50% faster during that period. Now, does that prove that the difference between the two isn't genetic? Well, it certainly shows that differences as great as the IQ gap can be closed environmentally.
Yeah, have you seen about the study? They went to 40 nations.
Yeah.
They went to 14 nations and measure basically IQ level. I think it's like 30, 40 years in between two time periods. And what they've seen is that the increase in IQ between one generation to the second is quite dramatic. This scientist called James Flynn. Yeah. So this is what it's called. Look it up if you want.
But I've actually been...
Let me introduce a couple of evidence. This is quite interesting. So what they look is the increase of intelligence, national IQ basically. The sample is like 80,000 people, 50,000 people. They look at the military. So if you look at France, between the year 1949 to 74, they increased their IQ level, national IQ level, with 25 IQ points. Yeah. It's not like their brain is developing in one generation. What is IQ actually measuring? So if France can increase national IQ level with 25 points with the right circumstances, why would you limit other nations to do that? That's just one country. Next country, Belgium, Netherlands, is 20 IQ points. Japan, that's between the year 1951 and 1975. That's 20 IQ points. So when you say race realism, do you think it's based strictly on biology? Or would you also say that there's actually a Second World War going on? Europe was broken, Japan was broken. Of course, the next generation will do a lot better. But if you don't take that context in consideration, then you will reduce it to be about biology. What do you say about that?
That's right.
And so ultimately, that a lot of what we're talking about is genes are not destiny, and we still have an opportunity to make some decisions of the things that we can modify.
Okay, so let me address that a couple of different ways. So
Sure.
as for the Flynn effect and stuff, I'm very familiar with the Flynn effect and other such studies. I've been kind of like, I'm not a biologist, but I've got a fair amount of understanding of genetics or quantitative genetics.
Sure.
The Flynn effect, for example, and consequential effects fighting against it, like regression to the mean, and consequential effects of saying what is a changing population, a population size of genetics, having a reinforcing effect on the gene pool. These are things that we don't know enough about.
Thank you.
But what we do know, which is
Yeah.
not disputable, is that even if you took, so I used to work in investment banking in the capital markets for a decade, and there's a saying in the capital markets that says, a rising tide lifts all boats. So if you have differences that could vary across the population, so there's some really, and I don't want to use terms like epigenetic, but if there's some way that we could improve ourselves as a species, it does not explain what you would have to almost make as an a priori assumption that divergent evolution in human races somehow has an equality component. So if our skin, our morphology, our bacteria, our bone structure, our muscle mass, if everything has subject to biological evolution, why is the brain taboo?
No, it's
The
not
brain-
taboo. It's
Oh,
not.
okay.
It's not taboo.
So let me just-
What I
absolutely.
want to challenge you on is
So if you
because
just let me
I
finish my
don't.
point for just a second, and
I apologize.
No worries, don't worry so much. So if you look at that effect and you say IQ is one of those things, well, IQ isn't just one of those things. Well, IQ is just an obvious way to measure something that is longitudinally and cross-culturally got an update. Is the data good enough? No, it isn't. Is the data? But the data has got a lot of good things. It's a high predictor of success. It's a high predictor of outcome of what possible professions you can take. It's clearly that people, when they were socially scaffolded, as you've seen the recent studies for Harvard and Yale, who were put into Ivy League colleges by social mechanisms, immediately fail when they're competing with peers of higher IQs. So to accept that IQ is not real or IQ is not relative is not the same as accepting or saying that IQ is relatively uncertain and unstable and might be evolving. It might have the Flynn effect. It might regress to the mean and hop once more forward. We look in our daily life in neorealism, we look around and we say, people are smarter and different, and some races and some subcultures are smarter. If you break the IQ test down into subcomponents, because IQ is just a very coarse number, it's a
Sure.
G-loaded test. If you look at the 14 subcomponents in the G-loaded test, let's look at some ratio taboo topics. Ashkenazi Jews, they're really smart, right? Yeah, but they're not that smart. They're very smart in certain components. So, for example, they have very high verbal linguistic skills, they have very high verbal dexterity, they're very good at reasoning, but they're not very good, for example, at problem solving and structural spatial scores. So what do we see in society? Jews are very strong in the media, in law, in academia, but not as many of them relative to their peer percentage capture in space, tech, and computing. That's a white man's place. So you can see that fundamental differences that start in the genes without making any moral judgment or any political claims. We can see that genetic variation within genetic populations that had evolutionary divergence lead to macro structures in society that you can see both in the data and anecdotally in the daily life. All we say in the New Right is our political philosophies must take into these accounts. If I know 40% of your political views are hereditary, I know 30% of this is hereditary, I know 26% of that is hereditary, to not correlate that to social science data is just scientific poppycock, and we will reject.
Yeah. So I want to straw man on you. You said that this is basically the environment and genetics are both working together.
So I would argue that the evidence in totality shows that the difference is not genetic, but has to do with differences in the subcultures. It's quite clear to me that Asian Americans tend to outperform whites because they come from a subculture that puts an even greater emphasis on cognitive ability than whites do. It's interesting, you walk into a restaurant, a Chinese restaurant, and there's a little kid sleeping over his books, and he suddenly wakes up and picks up the book again. That is, for him, it's just second nature to do his homework, and there it is in front of him.
That's less true in white homes and less true still in black homes. You find, as Thomas Sowell, who's a black historian, points out, you find that in many cases that while blacks want their children to do better at school, they don't set up the proper atmosphere for developing cognitive ability. For example, they'll be over the moon if the kid makes an athletic team, but be perfunctory if they bring home a good arithmetic score. I take it in a Jewish home, it's just the difference. If a Jewish kid makes the sports team, the parent often says, "Are you crazy? You're playing football, you'll get brain damage, you won't get to medical school." And the emphasis on academic achievement is overwhelming. I talked to a Chinese physiotherapist recently when she was giving me some physio. And she said she'd been talking to a friend of hers who said that her daughter had flunked a test. And she said immediately to this East Asian woman, "You mean a real fail or a Chinese fail?" And of course, it wasn't a flunk at all. She'd gotten a B+.
Oh, no.
In the mind of her parents was a flunk. So I think things have improved. You know, over the last generation, blacks have gained 5 points on whites. So it may be that black practices in the home and the exposure of black children to cognitive challenging is improving over time. And another interesting thing, as the Dickens Flynn article shows, that it's wrong to think that blacks are today, let's say, 15 points behind whites. Today they're only 10. And that's at about the age of 11 or 12. And you find at the age of 4, they're only 5 points behind whites. You find in the Harvard infant tests at the age of about 8 to 12 months, they're not behind at all. You find at older than the ages of 11, they can be as much as 20 points behind. And I have tried to set up an analysis of black life that shows why at every step black culture presents less of an environmental enrichment than white. I don't have any trouble at all at the age of 24 when blacks have now fallen away to a very large deficit with white, because, of course, 1/3 of black males are convicted of a felony, and blacks on average between 18 and 24, more of them serve time in jail than go to university. And, of course, more black mothers tend to be solo mothers. If there are not enough black males to marry, you're likely to have a child by someone who's not a promising husband. So there's no difficulty why between the ages of 18 and 24, why blacks lose IQ ground on whites. It is, as I say, if you're more likely to have a jail term than to be in university, that's not a very rewarding environment. And the black sociologist at Harvard, I'll try and think of his name in a moment, who says black teenage culture is less rewarding of cognitive ability than white. The whites play at, of course, imitating black culture, but they're much more serious about studying for the SATs. Well, the black teenage culture, with its emphasis on music and hanging out at shopping malls, this tends to make for less cognitive challenge, let's say, between the ages of about 13 and 18. And if you go back below the age of 13, you find that blacks aren't usually in as good schools as whites. And if you go back below the age of 6, you again run into Elsie Moore, that something is going on in black preschooling that's not as cognitively challenging as white preschooling. So I think I can show, through an analysis of the black experience in America, exactly why they lose more ground on whites with IQ with age.
What's dangerous with this conversation is, if you don't include information like this, can you show my screen again, Manny? If you don't include information like this, when countries are increasing their IQ level, national IQ level, with 20 IQ points, 12, 15, 9, 25, I think here, yeah. That's Belgium, Netherlands, Japan, it's 14 nations. Within one generation, what people will do is they will reduce it to genetics, which is very dangerous.
There is, of course, decent evidence that there are sociocultural effects on IQ. I mean, the Flynn effect, which is named after the man who described the phenomena, indicates that the average IQ has been increasing quite substantially over the last 100 years. And the reason for that, no one knows for sure. But one of the putative reasons for that is that we've lifted the bottom out of catastrophe. So there aren't people whose IQs are stunted by by exposure to zero information during critical developmental periods and who didn't get enough to eat.
Yeah,
so
I was going to say severe malnutrition, never mind zero information. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So we've wiped out, in many ways, we've wiped out the worst effects of privation. And that's increasingly true as well on the worldwide scale, worldwide stage. You know, there's about 150,000 people a day right now being lifted out of absolute poverty by UN standards, the fastest improvement in the history of the world by a huge margin, and also about 300,000 people a day being hooked up to the electrical grid. So we are making some progress removing the absolute privation problem, which is a non-trivial problem. The problem with most of the attempts to raise IQ is that they don't change the variance in IQ. They tend to raise the average IQ across the population, and that leaves the inequality, IQ inequality problem basically untouched. So there have been studies trying to estimate how much socioeconomic pressure, let's say, you have to place on an individual to raise their IQ. Lowering it's easy, right? Because making something worse is always easier than making something better. But if I remember correctly, if you take an identical twin who's adopted out at birth, in order to produce a 15-point increase in IQ compared to the other twin, which is a 1 standard deviation increase, and about the same as the average difference between a university student in an average state college and an average high school student, you have to move the one twin from the 5th percentile of socioeconomic status to the 95th percentile. So you need about a 3 standard deviation improvement in socioeconomic conditions to produce a 1 standard deviation improvement in IQ. So it looks like it can be done, but it's expensive, you know. And
yeah, I see what you're saying. I'm kind of surprised, actually. I mean, given, you know, we just mentioned malnutrition as one possible source of low IQ, one possible developmental source. I'm kind of surprised that to the degree that the Flynn effect might be due to things like a reduction of the number of people exposed to severe malnutrition, that it wouldn't have also simultaneously truncated the variance a little bit. That seems slightly surprising.
Well, it has, let me restate that. It has truncated the variance, although the data on that isn't as clear. So, but I do believe that it's a reasonable inference to make that the variance has been truncated. It's also hidden to some degree because the IQ tests are always renormed to keep the variance at a standard 15 points.
Yes.
So it makes it difficult to look retrospectively and see what's happened to the variance. So, but the other problem too is that, you know, you get these stories now and then about these companies that come out with claims that their brain exercises can improve IQ, and the literature on that is damn dismal. I can tell you, it's that the holy grail is to produce cognitive exercises that produce a legitimate impact on fluid intelligence, and like there's been a lot of work done on that, and the answer so far is that it doesn't work.
From some of these.
Yeah, well, they have shown some increases in spatial IQ, but there's not very many studies, and I would say they're far overbalanced by the other side of the research equation, which continually says, and I've looked at this because I'm really interested in the improvement of IQ. I mean, that's the holy grail in some sense, and that, the overwhelming preponderance of evidence suggests that you don't get generalization outside the narrow domain. Now, why that is, and even this, it's even worse, because you might say, well, imagine that you could take 5 different domains of intelligence, still associated tightly with G, and you had people practice routines in all 5 dimensions. Maybe you'd get generalization under those circumstances, and the results of the research attempting that indicate that no, as soon as you move away from those specific practice instances, you don't get generalization.
And I do want, I'm mentioning this because I want people to know what Flynn effect is. And I will also show another study about how much is genetics. They have, this one is from 2013. It's a really good study. It's a review of, I don't know how many studies it is, but they take a look at twin studies. And twins that are, I don't know how you say it, one egg twins. Is that what you said in English?
Yeah.
Yeah, one egg twins. And then when they don't share the same environment, when they are adopted, but they have separate environment. And what they can see is about 50% is inherited, meaning, you know, for those who want to reduce everything, racial realism, to genetics, they're making a huge mistake. So I just want you guys to have this. Take a screenshot of this one. It's really, really good to have.
Okay.
But this this is getting to the heart of the issue, because I don't think that any of the people that I've read, apart from like real kind of extreme leftists, essentially, deny the heritability of intelligence as a trait among individuals. It is more when you start trying to say that that there's a fundamental aspect of this that is racial, as opposed to genes passed down through individuals. Why do you and other race realists think that these studies in particular are relevant? I mean, I'm not denying that intelligence is heritable. I'm just saying it's not a racial thing. So how do they demonstrate your point? I think in order to make your case, there's a link missing. You need a leap of faith to get to the racial aspect that these data sets do not provide. So how do you respond to that?
I've read that, absolutely. But let me actually add some more numbers from you. I'm looking at some of my meta-analysis studies right here, right? So if you look at the heritability, you quoted one, the best number I have that's close to yours by another study you're looking at, is violent crime has a heritability of 55%.
Violent crime?
Yeah, antisocial personality, 50%. Income, 42%. Divorce, 32%. Let's just take divorce. Well, divorce is, just maybe a second. Yeah, so just divorce, something seems like an abstract, has got a heritable genetic component that's 32%. Of course, 68% is environmental. Our fundamental value proposition is not to posit the claim that the descriptive, deterministic behavior of the system is genetic. It is to say 32% of it is genetic. And for you to pretend that 32% is not genetic is scientific absurdity. We are not saying it is 100% genetic. Now, if you look at the group traits, what do we know? We know that these group traits are heritable, but they're not unilateral in what we would consider genetic mesh. They're compounding. Let me give you an example. If I took a population that had a 32% divorce rate, and I put them in lots of other populations that had the same 32% divorce rate, the genetic environment would keep evolving and reinforcing it. If on the other hand, I picked out one person or a small family with that gene pool and put them to an environment that's not like that, it would also have an effect. So we realize that it is a constant co-evolutionary dance between the genes and the environments. Our problem for the last 10, 15 years, because I've been working for a while on this sort of stuff, is that we decided after 9/11 that the fundamental end of liberalism that we saw coming would only be approached when these taboo subjects like biological realism, gender realism. So let's run that through for violent crime in the black. The largest meta-analysis of studies based on 50 years of twin studies data, so you've got that base grounding, for black US crime statistics, for example, shows that of the 11 control variable factors for all of them, none of them could explain disparities in black crime. But on the other hand, black crime, for example, we noticed that in the black if you work backwards down, aggression, if you select and control of aggression, and aggression is a cause of crime, great. So aggression, white, black, or brown is still a cause of crime. Going down, you see, well, hang on, if aggression is crime, what's the difference? Well, we see immediately that cortisol explains the difference between aggression in men and women. Men and women have totally different cortisol levels, but the epinephrine levels are different. And you see suddenly, gosh, so black people have a 22% variation in epinephrine versus cortisol. We say, what's that? Looking further down, you say, well, non-receptor CAB genes and repeat patterns are the cause of that, using androgen blockers. At this point in the scientific stack, none of these are moral statements. They are scientific statements. They don't describe a person's life. They define a statistical population. So working up the stack, we can say, hey, the following genes, RXC11B8, for example, is one of them. These genes propagate things that cause CAG copies to be made in genes. They move up into endocrinology and they cause hormone level differences. And these small hormone differences lead to social cultural structures that lead to crime. All we're saying is that... Can I just... All I'm saying is that you look at that scientific stack and you inform your social, moral, political things with that balance between genes and environments as pretending to some egalitarian abstract principle, hey, motherfuckers, we're all equal, kumbaya. That's all right. So let's take a very simple example. Let me just pull up some metadata here. If I looked at just a metadata study of the one I'm spoken about in the United States, right? So from 85 to 2014, large longitudinal study. It is violent crime. So murder arrest rate 52%, violent crime without murder 39%, crimes against property 29%. You see the disproportionate representation of violent aggressive crimes showing up in a particular segment of the community. I have nothing against black people, but I could show an example for white crime. I could show an example for Asian crime. It doesn't matter which one I pick. I'm not
is
picking.
it cross-cultural? Is it the same result in other places of the world?
Well, what's fascinating, it seems that of the 6 meta-analysis studies, the same black level crimes seem to almost show up at the same ratio level. So, for example, let me just...
Which nations were included?
Just bear with me a second. Okay, so looking, for example, just at the Home Office 2018 data set, there was a total of 779,000 arrests in the UK, fell down by 12%. Black people were 3 times more likely to be arrested than white people. So there's 38 arrests for every 1,000 and 12 for 1,000. So they are misrepresented 12 times 38. They're misrepresented almost 100 times the relative factor on a per capita basis. Those ratios are showing up similarly for the same genetic types in England, Australia, the United States, Canada, Sweden. So if you held the case that there was no genetic argument for this, and I couldn't care if they were black, Chinese, Vietnamese, or they all came from Karachi, it makes no difference. My point is that there is a genetic structural trace now that we can do using big data, lots of techniques, that says, look, there seems to be a bidirectional path as an explanatory power. The same applies for gender. If you take race off of the table, the same applies for gender.
Ralph, do you think that testosterone plays a big part in how
Absolutely.
maybe certain groups?
I know about the study you're referring. Now that I will just warn you, I've actually been quoting that study in the past in a video I was filming with no one else than Uzalu, and people commented on my YouTube and said that this study is outdated and that it was found that black people have the same level of testosterone. But
you have clear that testosterone is linked to aggression levels. It's worse than that actually, but let's just take it at the cause level of testosterone. But if you go down, you see that the cause of those factors can be traced in endocrinology all the way down to the genes.
Yeah, I'm a big fan. I'll try and articulate my question. It has to do with the role of testosterone and maybe some consequences of it and what we can do about it. So if it's not related to aggression, but it's related to an increased reward for status, where does it act in the brain? Does it act in the brain? And then, given that so many kids may suffer, especially these days, with impacts in the brain that might affect their aggression as adults, given the violence in the world today, would a pharmaceutical route be at all suggested before any kind of cognitive training? I mean, because it's the drug industry will latch onto anything, but I feel like that's something they haven't done. But I don't think that's a long-term solution either.
Great. Okay, which part of the brain has the most receptors for testosterone, the most sensitivity to it? Makes total sense. The amygdala. The amygdala is ground zero for sensitivity to testosterone. Does testosterone cause amygdala neurons to fire to, in effect, invent aggressive outputs? Not at all. If and only if the neurons are already firing, testosterone makes them fire faster. Testosterone does not turn on the martial music, it ups the volume if it's already been turned on. Now, in terms of, okay, so let's make the world a much better place here. How about we get rid of all those males? Okay, maybe not that. Okay, so at least let's castrate. Well, no, that's not very well. What about, okay, how about if we pharmacologically block some of the effects of testosterone? And what you see there, besides it being mighty scary, is a track record of not working very well in a number of places on Earth. The 2 places where it has most been explored is, big surprise, India and the state of Texas. There have been state-ordered chemical castrations, drugs which are given which block testosterone receptors, which is in effect the equivalent of removing testosterone from the scene, usually for intractably violent sexual offenders. And what the literature shows is essentially it has no effect whatsoever. Because such aggression has very little to do with aggression. It has very little to do with sexuality. It has a whole lot to do with domination and fear and issues like that. Pertinent to that, you take any male on Earth of any known species and take out his testes, and that almost certainly was the first experiment ever done in endocrinology about 10,000 years ago when some bull chased some people around the backyard one time too many, and they wrestled him down and got rid of the testes, and suddenly he was a much more tractable male. If you castrate a male of any species out there, on the average, levels of aggression go down. They never go down to zero, though. And the critical thing is the more experience that male had being aggressive prior to castration, the more it's going to stay there afterward. In other words, the more experience you have with aggression, the less it is dependent on hormones, and the more it is a function of social learning. So that, unfortunately or otherwise, is not much of a panacea there.
But when you say crime and testosterone, that's not the only explaining factor for testosterone. The more important thing with crime is stress levels. So black people, for example, have much lower stress levels than any other species. They're able to stay calmest under pressure. So, for example, some crack U.S. Special Forces stars are done only by black people because no white guy can outperform a black person on maintaining remarkable low levels of physiological stress. But physiological low levels of stress are highly correlated with crime. Studies again and again show a lot of people don't commit crime or get into fights because they get nervous, or what you and I would say, they bottle out, right? But that bottling out, for example, it has both a positive benefit in society, an example of the special forces, and it can have a negative benefit. So testosterone with the inversion of stress is a control factor for crime. Now, if I had an all-white society, and I was talking about no interracial issues, and I found these hormone variations within a subpopulation set, then the taboo of racism would go away, and you'd say, it's the fucking people from Hertfordshire, isn't it? Those fucking robbing thieves from Hertfordshire, they're muggers. If you cross the species, because we now have a globalized, connected world, and you make it over race, it's socially taboo. That is a disservice to the crime, the victims, everyone, because it has no scientific grounding.
Okay,
that's what race realism is, and therefore race realism has nothing to do with racism. Racism is a political concept invented in the 30s by the far left. The word didn't have an etymology prior to the 30s. So racism has got racism is what Raspeck's interested in. It's got nothing to do with race realism. Right?
Can I comment on that? All right.
Yeah.
I'll assume. Yeah. So correlation or prevalence is not the same thing as causation. Nope. And I need people to understand this simple point. So a lot of times there's two studies. I only have this one from Sweden, but there's two studies. One conducted in America, one was conducted in Sweden, about violent adolescent criminality, basically, and to see what the cause is, or if there's a correlation between poverty and criminality. And what they could see in America, the environment is very different compared to Sweden. Sweden is a welfare society. The poverty is not to such a level that you need to rob, you need to do criminality to survive. In America, it's a little bit different society. So poverty is a strong predictor for adolescent crime. But what I want to show here in Sweden, maybe supporting your point, but then I will also challenge one point. I need people to see this. Can you click on my screen? This is a huge study. So this study is conducted in 2013, and they went back from 1989 to 1993. 500,000 people are included in the study. This is a huge study. Basically, the question was asked, what is the relationship between childhood family income and adolescent violent criminality and substance misuse? And what they can see in Sweden is there's no association between childhood family income and subsequent violent criminality and substance misuse. There's no association between, at least not causal relationship. So one will not cause the other one. But if you look in a country like America, the environment is very different. So there you can see where you have at least strong vulnerability. So in this way, we can exclude things. Poverty does not necessarily lead to criminality.
I think to
hold on. So that this a little bit supports your point. But what I would criticize you is how come that you make a causal relationship, that you say that because you have higher level of, let's say, aggression on a group level or higher level of testosterone, that will cause you to be a more criminal. Why won't you include things like attitudes, ideology, and narratives that could be the cause?
Because they would only materialize in a single generation, right? They could only be an environment factor, and therefore they wouldn't be hereditary, right? Scientifically, right? So all I can show is cumulative genetical history of things that survive over n generations, i.e. longitudinally, and anecdotally, generation from T to T+1 would be the only thing that would have an environmental effect, in which case it's not going to be hereditary, right? So you're right to explain a particular set of things that would have a localized cultural, temporal behavior. And again, just to be crystal clear, the question here is not about is there no environmental impact? Or if I'm dealing with causation and correlation, those are very social sciencey kind of ways to look at the world. What we're saying is starting bottom up, which are the genetic traits of a feces that must feed in them, and a political, social environment that says you should therefore not ignore them because they're uncomfortable truths.
But that's not how science is conducted. You probably know this. I don't need to explain this. Science is not about proving what it is. It's about proving what it is not. So I've shown studies time after time. Please provide your references. Here's another one study. This one is from, what year is it? I think this one is around 2012, something like that. This is a longitudinal study, meaning they look at it from a long perspective. What they have here is 200,000 people in the study. Huge samples. Normally they use like 5,000, maybe 20,000. When you pass 50,000, that should be solid. And same result here. What they're trying to do is they try to exclude what it's not. In Sweden, as the study is conducted,
this all seems to be coming from Sweden, which is quite interesting, but carry on.
Sorry?
They all seem to be from Sweden.
I live in Sweden. But in Sweden at least, the results, there's no causal relationship. Do you understand? So that's what you do. You try to exclude what it's not.
Maybe I'm not sure.
How long? Yeah. What's left, that is your temporary truth. So I would encourage you to provide evidence why you think that the reason why you have higher level of criminality among blacks in America is that, or is it in other places as well? The cause for it, that's what I want you to provide evidence for.
Okay, well, we could take that in more detail offline, for example, and look at these. But obviously, let me ask you a deeper point so maybe I can try to understand your perspective coming into it. I don't think either of us need to talk about scientific method, type 1, type 2 areas. I mean, we don't need to bother.
Well, start by answering my question first. Could you provide reference where it says that testosterone is the cause for why people choose to become criminals? Because you can have higher level of something. It doesn't mean that you actually have to follow through and become a criminal.
And what we have to deal with, of course, instantly, if we're going to bring up hormones, is, so what's the deal with testosterone? What does testosterone have to do with aggression? Why is it that in virtually every species out there, males are more aggressive than females, males have more testosterone than females do? All you need to do to make sense of this whole section here is take everything from last week concerning testosterone and sexual behavior and just substitute aggressive behavior for sexual behavior. It's the same exact rules. Yes, testosterone is required for the full expression of aggressive behavior in males of most species. How do you tell? Subtracted out the castration stuff. After castration, do levels of aggression go down to 0? No. The same thing as last week. The more prior experience one has being aggressive, the less of a drop in aggression there is after testosterone levels are removed. Put back 100% the normal levels, aggression is reinstated. Put back 10% the normal levels, reinstated to the same extent, 200%, same extent, same exact rule. Testosterone is needed for the normal expression of behavior, but it is not necessary or sufficient, and your brain, your limbic system can't tell the difference between moderate, medium, and very high levels of testosterone. There's no way you could look at an individual's testosterone levels, and because it's 2 units higher than it was last week, or higher than the person sitting next to them, to make any sort of prediction about who is going to be more aggressive. When you see a correlation between levels of aggression and levels of testosterone, it's the behavior driving the testosterone, not the other way around. How does this translate into physiology? Here's one example of this in terms of studies. Take 5 rhesus monkey males, and this was a classic study that was done, put them together and they form a dominance hierarchy. Number 1 beats 2 through 5, number 2 beats 3 through 5, so on. Take number 3 and pump them up with testosterone. Pump them up with insane amounts of testosterone, and what you will see is he will now be involved in more fights. Does that mean that number 3 is now threatening number 2 and number 1? Absolutely not. What's going on? Number 3 is being a nightmare to numbers 4 and 5. Is testosterone changing the structure of aggression in this group? No, it's exaggerating the pre-existing social structure.
But I'm not saying testosterone. I've never said no. I mean, you would have to have if you forgive the joke, you'd have to have a negative IQ to think testosterone causes crime, right?
Yeah, can you clarify?
Testosterone, of course, it doesn't cause crime. What we have is the biggest single causal factor for crime is aggression.
Is what?
Aggression.
Aggression.
Yes. Now we can therefore trace aggression there's no dispute of aggression is a single causal repeatable factor across meta-analysis studies. If there's some way we can all guys collaborate and share links, I can send you studies after studies and all this stuff that says that aggression is the causal factor. Now that's aggression then goes down into what is the variation between the populations, because there's none of the meta-analysis studies that try to isolate a non-genetic reason. Let me give you an example. You give me just a second as we're talking. I could bring up all the factors from the 11 studies I meant, but they included poverty rate, crime, a host of social reasons, could not explain the variation of the black crime.
I'd love to see the studies actually.
Absolutely, I think I would send them with you, share them with you if you can come
Maybe
back.
you can share it on screen.
Yeah, but I'm not. This is my
okay, no problem. But I'd love to have them.
Well, we can have as many follow-ups. But let's pretend for a second that these are pending refutation by yourself, and let's pretend they're true. And if you run down this thing just to get the framework of the argument, so I can ask you my question. Sure. So if you expect that there's a framework of an argument, where of course we use type 1-2 errors.
Sure, can you speak a little bit slower? It's a little bit hard.
So if we let's say for example we agree there's a scientific method and we know how to do things with the type 1, type 2 errors. We understand causation versus correlation.
Yeah.
What we're saying is not that. What we're saying fundamentally is we are looking for a thread that connects something from, let's take the violence story all the way down, shall we? So let's pretend I'm not going to cite lots of sources here because it's very dull. Let's pretend the story is true.
Sorry, a little bit slower. English is not my first language.
I'm so sorry. So let me try to weave a little thread of a story. I'm going to use an analogy for everyone else, which I use when I talk about genetics to other people. I'll use the analogy of a multi-story building. At the top of the story of the building, we have a phenomenon called crime on the 10th story. On the 9th story of that building, we have a thing called black crime versus white crime. Underneath that, we have to say, well, what's the single biggest factor for crime, white or black? And it looks like it's aggression. So, okay, so aggression is the next causal factor of crime. Well, what causes aggression? You mentioned testosterone. I can mention cortisol. I can invert cortisol and say epibasprin's version inverted to cortisol are hormonal descriptions.
Attitudes, narrative, ideology.
No. I'm in biology right now.
But you can't exclude things like that. You have to include the whole picture.
No. So let me start.
Attitudes, narrative.
Let me start the question again because you missed the top picture. I start with the top phenomena of crime, and I look at all the factors: poverty, child poverty, relative income, education. The largest meta-analysis study tried 11 different statistical models. The only thing that falls out as causal, not corroborating causal, is aggression. So now I say aggression is my cause. So all your social factors are now in the 10th story of the building. And I say, well, what the hell? How did I get to aggression? Not everyone who's aggressive commits a crime. Yes, we know.
Can I interject real quick? I'll let you interject real quick. So when you guys are speaking of crime, are you speaking specifically of violent crime or other types of crime that include fraud and whatnot?
So no, we're talking about violent. The highest level is murder. Underneath that is violent crime that doesn't lead to murder. Then there's just violent aggravated crime. And then the next set of crimes are crime against properties. So there's crime against the person in the law, and then there's crime against objects, and then lower level misdemeanors. The highest crime is murder, followed by violent close to murder and degraded forms. We're talking about the most acute physical crime, typically. So aggression does not play a part in things like low-level shop theft. It always plays a part in murder.
So one thing I want you to provide evidence for, you said it's cross-cultural, which just means that you should have the same results in different nations.
No, only in the nations where they're... Well, see, the idea here, that's why I want to... Let me step up a second. Let me ask you a different question, just so I can understand.
No, you respond first to mine.
No, because I haven't really asked you my original question. Just understand your orientation, sir, that's all. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Answer my question first. Do you have a study that shows that it's beyond American context?
I have studies that show the specific 6 or 7 countries where black populations have the same crime numbers.
I would love to have that. Maybe we can follow up.
We'll keep saying I'll add all the data you want as much as possible.
Beautiful, yeah.
Now let me ask you my question.
Please do, yeah.
Not to try to argue with you, just to try to orient myself to where you're coming from.
The reason that I got into it is because time and time again, I noticed with different ideologies, you basically have ideologues that start, spreading their ideas. And in order to strengthen the ideas, they are going to try to get something scientific to back them up. And I'm talking about creationists, Marxists through Digra, the people who are for or against global warming, people who say that vaccines cause autism, all of these people, they're eventually going to get some sort of scientific evidence that they claim they have. And they will present a paper. Now, the public is uneducated enough in the field in order to understand the paper. For instance, in my case, I really didn't understand it. I had to ask a friend of mine that's a biologist, because it takes, 4 years in order to get the foundation, in order to understand what's being discussed there, because otherwise people wouldn't go to universities if it was so simple to understand just any scientific paper. And the thing is that the moment you disagree with it and you say, look, this paper is not peer reviewed, which is like one of the only solutions for someone like me to even remotely verify if a paper is okay or not, they will say, oh, peer review doesn't matter. And you'll be like, okay, well, I'm going to ask an expert. And they say, oh, no, that's appeal to authority. I mean, the only logical conclusion for me, if I want to understand the paper, would be to go through university, study that field for 4 years, and then read it, which is absurd. And if you look in real life on how people understand science that they don't know, you can look at judges. They call experts in the field to explain the science to them. You look at politicians, they call a committee of experts, a committee of scientists from that field to explain the science to them. It's unreasonable to ask a person to understand what's in a scientific paper from a field he never studied. And you say that, okay, if I'm going to ask an expert, it's appeal to authority. But when you basically point to the ideologue, to the blogger that say vaccines cause autism or whatnot, and he has a paper, isn't that also an appeal to authority?
Let me ask you a simple question. Do you believe there's a genetic description for crime?
I'm not sure about that. I need to look up.
Okay, let me ask you a simple question. Do you think genetics plays any part in crime?
I don't know.
So
yeah, I mean, antisocial personality disorder is something inherited. I love this disorder. Yeah, but that's the anomaly. So when you apply it on
you're ducking my question. My question is simple. Do you believe there's a genetic description for phenomena like antisocial behavior order, crime, divorce rate?
When it comes to antisocial, personality, so of course, yes, many of these are inherited. Okay. But that's the anomaly. I mean, the amount of people who have.
That was all my question. Only question was.
Yeah, but let me also explain it. The amount of people that are antisocial personality, that have this antisocial personality disorder, they're like 1.5%. So it's not a huge part of the population.
Okay, so
1.5 to 6% actually.
Okay, so different studies and different phenomena are going to show up with different slider. If everyone who's not interested in genetics or knows a lot about the subject, we can imagine a sliding scale from left to right. 0% genetic, 100% genetic, 0% social, 100%. Every phenomenon is going to have a value of the slider. You've now accepted the claim that a value of that slider is being set. Different phenomena will have different values of that sliders. And because sociological phenomena are complicated, we can expect a compounded interaction of those sliders together. As long as we start with the basis that you agree there's a genetic component of that, you are fundamentally, whether you know it or not, you are a race realist.
No, I am evidence driven. So I mean, so far, I've just heard your opinions. I'd love to see the studies.
Absolutely. You keep saying that again, but we just waste our time here.
All right. So can I just interject for a minute, Ralph?
There's something flawed. I mean, I just showed you that 50% is about something you inherit in IQ. So you have another 50% when you can actually affect it by by environment. Yeah. So if you would allow a country like France to increase the IQ level to 5% without necessarily tying it to their biology, you tie it to the environment because you have Second World War. That's the first time that they measured the IQ test, and then they went at 30 years, right? So that there was environment that increased it. So why won't you let other nations have the same mobility, same journey? Why would you reduce it to biology?
So there's possibly three questions in there. So let's start with the first part, which you've gone back to multiple times, is no one's saying there's not an environmental factor.
Yeah.
It's, if anything, you seem to have an a priori judgment or a priori preference for the environment. So, for example, when I asked you, do you know something? You said no. Well, as a scientist, you know, if you don't know the answer yes or no, you must sit in the middle line at 50%, right? But you seem to have an a priori bias for it not to be biological.
No, that's not what I said.
But that's the sentiment and tone comes and says, why won't you accept the factors? When I keep saying, I'm accepting the factors.
Well, I actually have something prepared for you. So here it is, antisocial personality disorder, in front of your face here.
Yeah.
This is DSM-5.
Yeah.
As you see, can you see it on the screen? Manny, can you click on it?
I can see it. I don't know about other
Yeah,
people.
I just want to make sure that our audience, we're doing this for educational purpose. Yeah. So the prevalence here is, from population, it's about 0.2% to 3%. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, yes, there's a genetic aspect to it. But when you started to basically push this over a population or race, you're doing a huge mistake.
Okay, so let me ask you a question.
It's a leap of faith. That's what I'm saying.
Let me ask you a question for the audience to understand, because I didn't know I was meeting you. I don't have no idea who you are. I would be prepared to. Can you show me a study, given that your biases are always for the tiny percent? Can you show me a study you brought that as a bias the other way?
I just showed you right now. Environment in violence and poverty. There was no causal relationship.
Okay, but in a nation like Sweden. Show me examples of studies you prepared that come from the other end of the bias.
Which end do you want?
So what I'm saying is, can you show something that has a high genetic component?
Well, I just showed you that 50% is genetic.
Okay,
when it comes to IQ.
Okay, so maybe I don't understand what you're trying to say. Are you saying that the fact that it's so maybe maybe it's a language thing? Can you repeat what your point is?
Yeah, my main point is like this: just because you have certain level, let's say, of personality traits, you're making a leap of faith when you take that to be the reason why you are violent or why you are becoming a criminal. For example, you're a Christian, I'm a Christian as well. In our ideology, we have something called the fruit of the spirit, which is basically, if you're a Christian, you should have these 7 traits. And one of these traits are self-restraint, right?
Yes, absolutely. Self-restraint is highly associated.
Self-restraint, that's very important.
Right.
You respect yourself and you don't follow your emotion. That's something very important, which will affect how I behave. You understand what I mean? So you said environment, we said biology, but I also want to include narratives, ideology, belief system, and so on. And that's what I would want you to include.
Okay, so again, maybe it's just me, or perhaps I'm really struggling, and you must forgive me here because it must just be me. Are you trying to argue for the fact that if there is, let's take a simple example. Suppose there's some higher order function, let's call it the opposite of opposite of impulsiveness. Let's talk about restraint. So if we look at these restraints measured in the phenomenon of time to wait, right? So if I look at time to wait, or for people who don't know that, are people familiar with the marshmallow literature and all of that, right? So I give you one marshmallow. Well, I can give someone one. I can give you a reward that says, "Hey guys, you want a pint right now? But if you wait for half an hour, I'm going to give you 4 pints."
Ability to postpone.
And then what you do is you measure that to say, is that someone who can defer their gratification, i.e. a proxy for self-control? The literature collapses all that to a thing called time to wait. So if you look at time to wait as a phenomenon without making a moral a priori judgment, or even a moral priori, you'll find that time to wait has clear correlation variations between who are the top time to waiters, the Germans and the Scandis. Who are the second time to waiters, the Anglo-Saxons. So if you look at the study, you see there's a genetic component of time to wait. Now,
well, how would you make that conclusion? Isn't that a leap of faith? If
I can send you all the studies. I can send you all.
No, but hold on. If you live in a society where this is a virtue, if you live in a society where this is encouraged, if you live in a society where how would you reduce that to genetics?
Okay, so now you're jumping up and down. But let me follow you up. So if we accept the base value that there's a phenomenology called time to wait, and if you understand that we can measure population differences and they're genetically sourced, the high level says, well, genes do express themselves in environments. Enter the environment, like enter the dragon. Okay, no one is saying because I, as a population, have a statistical cluster that has this percentage of propensity says either an individual will make that happen, that the outcome is a priori either deterministic or without being too technical, of a different class of determinism. No one is saying that. What we are saying is to ignore the genetic causes for it, not to exclude the social code, but to ignore the genetic causes is the denial of biological realism. We are not making the positive claim that, everything must be caused in a priori derivative form. We're saying the social market academia does not want to speak about, for unscientific reasons, does not want to speak about generative causes. They might not be deterministic, right?
I do understand what you're saying. But I guess my criticism against you, which I would want you to provide evidence, this is my closing statement, is that if you compare two civilizations, two nations on the same thing when it's about postponing gratification, and in one civilization, you have middle-class people in much higher grade than the other civilization. And in the first civilization, if it's certain values, certain ideologies, certain belief system, then you need to include that as well. I would be careful to say that the genetics is the cause of it. That's what I would want you to
if you said that, if someone said that genetics was the cause of something, it's because they don't understand science, right? The genetics can't be the cause of it. All the genes can do is create phenotypical expressions of a trait. The trait only expresses itself in an immersed environment, right? So even if, and you and I probably know, and I have no idea what your background is there, but whatever your background is, you must understand that there's no computational mathematical system that could predict such determinism anyway. But even if there was such a deterministic biological explanation, it would terminate as soon as it entered the environment. What I'm saying is the environment is not the reason necessary for some phenomena like black crime. Black crime doesn't look like it's environmental bad news, but other things will be environmental, right? Perhaps child learning, child rearing. We're saying which ones have a balance between genetic and environment. They're never going to be purely genetic at a high enough level, and they're never going to be purely social for deep enough phenomena. This is what we call biological realism.
I would accept correlation, but that's also something that can change with time. So,
everything is evolving.
And I guess the problem is when you say this is something that caused this, because it's very, very hard to make that conclusion. And maybe that's not what you're saying. So let's follow up another time.
No, but let's follow up another time.
So yeah. So can I just one of the things is about immigration that I want to go on to, and one of the things I said in Raspik's last live stream that there is a brain drain if you have open immigration from these third world countries, because what happens is all of the top level people within those countries will start to drift over to Europe or more prosperous countries, and in the countries that are considered third world are going to lose their top people to kind of bring them out of poverty. So in a way, they're kind of like shooting themselves in the foot to a certain degree.
But it even happens like within the white population. Think of the average IQ where I'm sitting here in Twickenham versus the average IQ back from where my mother is from in up the Cannon Valley. Now there's a reason why the IQ is going to be higher here than it is down there. One of the reasons is somebody like me, who has an IQ in the 140s, has moved away. I've moved up here, and obviously I'm going to attract a partner who, similarly to Rocky Mystery, earns more than me. So her IQ is not going to be bad either. And then our offspring is going to be, but the people who are left, who are invariably going to be on welfare.
There's a brain drain in places like that, basically, because there are no opportunities, are there really? Because there's such a pessimistic attitude to things.
That's Charles Murray's whole point. Is that they're basically you're basically creating Brave New World or Gattaca or something like that without even realizing it, because people naturally do seek out the genes, and the girls who are left behind, whether black or white, are basically having one-night stands with men who are going to bugger off, and they're married to their state and they're single mothers, and that child has got the double whammy of lower IQ plus single-parent family.
Yeah, that is such an important point that I've learned since making my video, is that assortative mating isn't like some newfangled idea that people should probably look into doing. People do it, probably unconsciously, but people do already assortatively mate. But like you said, Rocky Mystery, it's kind of a lot of people assortatively mate for the wrong reasons. So, for example, talking about, unfortunately, in London at the moment, we've got this whole issue with this, the knife crime and the gun crime and so forth. One of the reasons for that is that a lot of black people in England will have children with the baddest dude on the block, the finest chick on the block, who is also so loose, so frivolous, not interested in anything academic. It's just purely all about partying and whatever, drinking.
The bad boy, basically.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of like in these environments, like academic agent said, with regard to the one night stands and single parents and all that sort of stuff, you do get an assortative mating, but it's an assorting downwards, and whereas for the for the people who are higher intelligent, they'll go off to uni. They'll meet other people who are similarly of higher intellect and so forth, who've got certain values, middle class values as we call them, and so forth, and they'll mate accordingly. I've done it. Do you know what I mean? Everyone and all my circles are, most of them anyway, have done the same
Here's
thing.
the point with this: it's not just the migration from somewhere like Wales to London. It's also international migration, because the people who are leaving places like Uganda or the people who manage to find a way out of Zimbabwe, for example, are invariably going to be in the top 20 percentile of their IQ, or the people like my father who are going to leave Iran are going to be in top percent. He's the person who's not going to stick around while the Ayatollahs wreck the country. All of those people. So it's like a double whammy brain drain. So a place like London steals the best from all the other countries in the world, and also steals the best from all
the
of the
rest
people
of
in
the country.